Hello, I'm Lauren Christensen, a senior staff editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival for The Landscape of Loss, a conversation about the challenges, complexities, and value in writing about grief. I'm really grateful to be joined today by three authors who've done just that in memoirs that reveal the vast spectrum of our experiences of loss, but also those aspects of mourning that, no matter what our circumstances, are universally human. Before we begin, I want to remind you all that these books can all be purchased in the link below. So joining me are Kat Chow, a former reporter for NPR's Code Switch, whose debut memoir, Seeing Ghosts, tells the story of her Chinese American family before and after the death of her mother when she was 13. We also have Adam Mansbach, the prolific author of, among other titles, the best-selling Go the Fuck to Sleep, and this year's genre-bending memoir in verse about his younger brother's suicide called I Had a Brother Once. And last but not least, Nadia Owusu, the Whiting Award-winning debut author of Aftershocks, about her upbringing with a Ghanaian father, a Tanzanian stepmother, and an absent Armenian-American mother, an upbringing that took her around the world from Tanzania to England, to Italy, to Uganda. Thank you all so much for joining me. And more importantly, for sharing your stories in these really beautiful and important memoirs. Before I jump into my questions, I'd really love to ask you all to read a short passage or however long you'd like to read from your work. We can just go around. Nadia, can we start with you?
Sure. I will just read a very short little paragraph. It's from a chapter called Homesick. And I don't think you need to know anything. We soon moved to a new apartment that was just 10 minutes away from where we lived when my father was alive. Sometimes I'd walk over to the old place and sit on a big rock at the edge of the park across the street and stare into the darkened windows. For a month, the apartment was empty. I could imagine myself back inside. I imagined turning on the lights in the living room. There was my father in the rocking chair, scotch on the side table next to him. His eyes were closed. On the CD player, Miles Davis blew his horn, Autumn Leaves. My father's fingers tapped the bass line on the chair's arm. Annabelle lay on the daybed by the window, and Kwame on her belly. They slept sound, easy. Yasmin and I played checkers on the rug. I always sat on that rock long enough so that my face and feet began to sting from the cold. Then one day, a light did turn on inside. A woman stood in the living room window. Behind her were piled high cardboard boxes. She was moving in. She would make a new home. I didn't stay to see if there were others with her, a husband, children. It would be impossible, I knew, to find my family there again. That apartment had been my home only because it had contained us. My father, Annabelle, Yasmin, Kwame, and me. In that apartment, we were whole. We were 5. When we left, we were 4. Homesick, I walked slowly across the park. My temporary footprints trailed behind me in the mud. I'll stop there.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam, do you want to go next?
Sure. This is from early in the book. This is the moment that my father calls me and tells me that my brother David has killed himself. It's midnight, and although I'd normally be home and asleep, I happen to be out DJing at a club in Philadelphia. So I step outside of the club and take the call. My father's sentence was unrecognizable, a cluster of words spinning in a void. The notion that it was all a mistake flashed through me and fell instantly to ash. No parent would say such a thing about his child, to his child, if there was any hope. And here begins a different kind of struggle on this page, akin to keeping the steering wheel perfectly straight. A struggle not to crane out of this shot, not to add voiceover, not to do the one thing I am trained to, which is make things legible, impose structure and plot, motivation, a frame, a double helix of narrative to snake through the spine, to be the spine. Here I am, here we are, not 50 feet from the news of my brother's suicide, and already I can feel a tug at the reins. I don't know if naming these things can sap their power or if it constitutes a sacrifice at their altar, an invitation to the impulse I am trying to disperse. What are the rules of this endeavor? Am I supposed to unfold the moments of this night like an origami crane, crease by crease? Is that the penance or the healing, the ritual, a march toward or away from what? Penance for what? If you are making up the ritual as you go, is it a ritual? If the loss is a hole that cannot be filled, is the remainder of your life the ritual? Are rituals supposed to fill the hole or deepen it until you can crawl out the other side? And who am I that I have to ask? My mother's father's parents were the children of famed rabbis. They came here and founded a Jewish community in Burlington, Vermont, by paying other Jews to keep the Sabbath, making them whole, and a minion by handing out the wages they would have lost in observing the holy day. And here I am, not even 150 years later, acting as if the books my people carried and died for are unknown to me. Here I am, freighted by nothing, reinventing the wheel, reinventing the rack, daring to believe that perhaps you only realize a ritual was one after you complete it. Inscribe the final character. A tear falls on the page, becomes the final period, or some stupid maudlin shit like that.
Thank you. Kat?
Thank you for that, you two. The section that I'm going to read comes from the beginning of Seeing Ghosts. And in the paragraphs before it, I talk about this poet, Diana Coy Wynn, whose collection Ghost of is beautiful and really resonated with me. 2 years after her brother's passing, Wynn decided to tackle with words the empty spaces that her brother left behind in those photos. She said that in her work, she was trying to mourn, not exorcise. When I first read this, I was startled by how much this resonated. I have never wanted to exorcise you. I am too attached. My inclination is to preserve you, to taxidermy you like you wanted. But mommy, grief is a container of contradictions. I want to expel something, though I do not know what. I want to rid myself of this heaviness, just as much as I want to keep your ghosts. Writing about you is a strange act itself. I am perhaps afraid of it, or at least I dread it. Yet I feel compelled to write you into being. I am hopeful, though. I spin you out of myself and into something else. Thank you.
Thank you all. Those were really beautiful passages, and I think give the audience a really good sense of your really unique voices. The first question I want to ask you, and you all really touched on this in those passages, but you know, I'm thinking of Adam early in your book. I think somewhere around the passage you read, you write that you could linger in a preamble forever, and the, you know, the, I guess there's this tension between sort of delaying and avoiding this inevitable moment where you actually have to begin to tell the story, but also this real urgency to tell that story. And I felt that in all three of these books very strongly. And I think it's a, it you know, just has to be a common thread through grief memoirs. And I'd love to just hear from each of you about that tension, how it existed for you, this struggle, you know, an urgency to write it, but also a real fear of writing it. Whoever wants to jump in to start.
I'm taking myself out of the running, so it's one of you two.
Oh, that's not fair. Okay, I can go. I think that it's so easy to turn away. And, you know, one of the things that I try to play with in Seeing Ghosts is that instinct to be afraid of this grief that is haunting and scary, and not even just, you know, grief over an explicit person. I always try to think of this book not exactly as a memoir of grief, but of loss as it relates to what my family experienced over generations, especially as immigrants too, and the ways we inhabited those negative spaces. And so I loved the idea of making this idea of loss a little bit menacing with the form of ghosts and the elements of taxidermy that I bring in as a way to make it maybe hurt less when writing about it. And so I try to even make my mother into this taxidermic ghost figure that is kind of alluded to in the passage that I read. And I found that a helpful way to embody that tension of wanting to look away at something that is so perhaps disturbing and uncanny, but feeling so um, determined to also preserve that form and memory.
Nadia, how about you?
Sure, and that really resonates with me. I think for much of my life, I avoided the act of grieving. I think I just decided that it was too hard to sort of examine those emotions, and I was just going to carry on. And, my family, for a long time, I think was in a state of denial. And we just had to sort of figure out how to put the pieces of our lives back together after my father passed away. And for those who haven't read the book, my mother left when I was 2 years old. And so I think, and I had never grieved that loss either. And so then my father passing away when I was 13 and sort of feeling rootless in a way. And I grew up moving all over the world. And so those were also losses. Every time we said goodbye to a country, it was another loss. And we had a life of losses that we never acknowledged, and I got very good at that. I became very adept at sort of carrying on. And so in terms of writing the story, it took me until I could no longer avoid looking at that grief. I could no longer avoid feeling it, and it sort of caught up with me to allow myself to think about writing the story. And in fact, I had no intention of sharing it. I was sort of compelled to write what eventually became this book as a private project and a kind of a way to explore those feelings of isolation and dislocation and disconnection and grief that I'd felt my whole life, but never allowed myself to fully feel. And so I think that tension for me existed as much in life as on the page. And by the time I came to sort of write the story, it was decades later. And I was really sort of giving myself permission to fully feel. And I've always been someone who has processed through writing. And so that was sort of my way into it.
What you just said really reminded me of a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you read Lisa Brennan Jobs's memoir, Small Fry, where she wrote about her really harrowing relationship with her father, Steve Jobs. And I just bring this up because in an event that the book review actually did with her, I'll never forget this, but she mentioned that, she wanted to be a writer. She'd always wanted to be a writer, but this was her debut book. This was just a book that she had to write to get it out of the way before she could kind of clear room to write about whatever else she wanted to write in her life. And I've just not really been able to forget that. I mean, just this idea of a kind of cleaning house or something, like it gets to that urgency and a kind of hesitant urgency, whatever that means, to write this story that you just feel is kind of clogging you or just taking up too much room. I don't know, Adam, if that's something that you feel as well.
Absolutely. It took me 8 years to start writing this book. When I sat down and actually began writing, it took me about 3 weeks to write the book. Part of that was not being emotionally ready to take it on. During that 8 years, I was very productive. And in some sense, I felt like everything I was doing, the books I was writing, the screenplays I was writing, were in avoidance of writing this book. I struggled a lot with the form this book would take. I'm sort of a novelist by trade, so my first inclination was to try to fictionalize it, figure out how to turn it into narrative fiction. It occurred to me to do it as an essay. It occurred to me even to do it as a screenplay. I always got stymied by the scaffolding, by the question of structure. And it was when I arrived at this form, which the book is essentially a long poem, that it freed something up in me to actually sit down and write. And I almost never got to that point. It was very much a coincidence. The first book I ever wrote is a book of poetry, but I haven't written damn near a single poem since. But I was asked to write something, I was commissioned to write a piece for an event that was happening at SF Jazz. I was going to be performing with a live band. I wanted to do something that would sing and work with the band. In a lot of ways, that event took me back a long ways in my life to the time when I used to be a roadie for a jazz drummer. I was on the road with Elvin Jones for 7 years, perhaps the greatest drummer ever. His story gets folded into this book as well. So there's a lot of comfort for me in being in jazz clubs. I spent a week with some remarkable poets and good friends who kind of reminded me how powerful the form can be at its best. And I came home and my brother would have turned 40 that week. And I sat down and just began to write in this form. And poetry allows you to do a lot of things that almost no other form does, right? You can make connections simply through proximity. There's not a lot of scaffolding. There doesn't have to be a lot of explicit structure. And you can amass a lot of lines and thus a lot of pages very quickly. So I think for me also, I felt like I had pushed off from the shore pretty fast. Like it felt a certain kind of way to spend 3 or 4 days in this room that I'm coming to you from now, just like writing to the exclusion of all else and crying and listening to music, and to look back and be like, well, shit, I've got 50 pages. I think I must be doing this. But yeah, it was a long time coming. And I learned a lot in the process of writing the book. I made a lot of connections that in retrospect seem fairly obvious, but that had never occurred to me until I sat down and tried to articulate all of this. I kept myself very busy for a very long time. And, you know, when the floodgates opened, they opened fully. And I did. I mean, just talking about it and being in this room really reminds me of the intensity of the process of actually writing this book.
You mentioned scaffolding a couple of times, and it really reminded me of this scene that I love so much in your memoir of when your brother, as a child, he was so he so protested the idea of like orthodontistry. he when your parents forced him to get braces, he actually ripped them off in some way. Like he himself took off his own braces. And then in the verse that you write, you really beautifully juxtapose that with your attempt to put like structure, to impose structure, a kind of like realignment of a story, of the natural progression of a life or of a tragedy with a narrative. And I loved that image. And it's something, you know, I think I want to hear from all of you, you know, so, okay, you've decided that you're going to sit down and write this. What are the ethics or challenges or just emotions involved in structuring a narrative around something that, you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could seem very unwieldy, right? Like just how do you even begin to put any kind of linearity on an experience this painful?
Yeah. Just to talk quickly about that scene. I mean, that's a scene that in some ways for me is emblematic of the struggles that I dealt with in the book, all of which have to do with the competing desires to take on and to reject a certain kind of narrative authority, to tell the story of an ultimately unknowable and terrible act. I'm sort of claiming my brother's story. I'm claiming the right to tell his story while also wanting deeply to preserve the unknowability of the act and to not pretend that by giving it language, giving it form, giving it my words, I am codifying it and making it a single knowable thing. And the braces thing, you know, it's a story that I told for years before his death. Yeah. The funny story of this quirky, eccentric, brilliant kid who told our parents he didn't want braces. They didn't listen. They told him he'd, you know, thank them in the future. Nah, he took them off within like 3 months. I was in 8th grade. He was in like 5th grade. I was out with friends. I came back in the middle of it and found him with like wires protruding from his mouth. Everything was sterilized. The orthodontist later told him he did an excellent job. I was like, my man, I was never here. I'm leaving. Like, I was out of there. But, you know, when you tell the story, when you circle back, do I leave that story as the kind of charming story of self-possession that it used to be? Or do I bookend it with where my mind now goes, which is that this was an act of reclamation of his body for the first, but sadly, perhaps not the final time? These are the kinds of things, like, in which universe does that story exist, or does it have to exist in both? And that ultimately leads me to the other thing I wrestled with a lot, which is just the nature of paradox, and trying to learn that paradox does not have to be something you resolve either in your life or on the page, but rather something you can just sit with and embrace and sort of admire from afar, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I loved what you were saying, Adam, about the idea of unknowable, you know, this unknowable act or this unknowable event. And I think when I wrote Seeing Ghosts and started the process, there was so much that I wanted to try and cover, but wasn't sure how to even begin. And one of the anchoring questions was, who is my mother? And then also, who is my father? And I wanted to use the way I learned to grieve from both of my parents as a kind of very loose structure for the book, where I wanted to explore my mother's sense of loss as an immigrant from China, and my father's also. And then I also wanted to add another layer of questions on top of it, which is, one of them is, what do we owe? And so what do we owe ourselves? What do we owe our cultures, our families, our bodies even? And what do we owe in death? Because I realized that there were just so many parallels between my mother's story, where she was the youngest child of, you know, multiple siblings, and her mother also died when she was young, and she was very much parented by her own siblings, and same with me. And my father also, you know, had a lot of unfulfilled grief and obligations related to remains that he had to carry out. And so being able to trace these parallels between myself and my parents helped kind of illuminate all of us and all of the losses we'd experienced. And so even though the book is quite fragmented, that helped me figure out how to steer it. And again, everything was grounded in this uncertainty of trying to reassemble and reconstruct this idea of who each of these unknowable people are, my mother and my father, as sort of ghost-like figures. And so that was something that really helped guide the book.
You just reminded me of this really chilling moment, and I think it was toward the end, but I noted that you wrote this in parentheses, but you wrote, "Mommy, I have long known I'd never be able to truly know you." And that just felt like a huge statement to me. It felt like a kind of light bulb or something. And the fact that it was written in parentheses made it so much more poignant. Like, I felt the pain in kind of realizing and then putting it on a page. But that idea, I mean, because you're talking about unknowability,
Yeah.
You know, when you were, of course you were so young, but also, you know, in other ways, don't we always, when writing about loss, kind of bump up against this like really naked fact that our ability to know someone else's life is always limited, right? Like by what they wanted to share, by what we choose to see, or what we're able to see, or whatever else.
Yeah, thank you for that. That section was toward the end So a bunch of Seeing Ghosts is written in direct address, you, because I loved the way that form is so, I always see it as trying to reach across a distance to understand someone, where you're trying to speak directly to someone and you're trying to close the distance between you and them as the narrator. And in that section, I think I'm actually addressing my father, and the aside is to my mother as sort of there are so many ghosts that we won't ever understand, living or dead. And it's a really painful thing to have to reconcile with. So thank you for that read. I really appreciate that.
Nadia, I wanted to ask you about the different kinds of loss that you describe in your book. I think at one point you mentioned that your grandmother was always afraid that her mother would leave her, and that your mother felt that way about her mother, and it just being this kind of very natural fear, this very human fear that we are going to be alone, or we are going to be, we're going to not be taken care of. And you write, there are different kinds of absence. And I felt that immensely. How does the grief change? You mentioned your mother leaves when you're 2. And you barely remember her when you see her again as a still young child. But how does the grief change when there's a choice involved? Right? I mean, when there's when someone still exists, and she's there and accessible in some ways, but not really there for you in ways that you need.
Yeah. So I think part of the project of this book was sort of writing into the different kinds of absence and grief and allowing myself to kind of look at it in that way. Like I grew up sort of because I didn't remember my mother. She left when I was so young, and she would show up periodically, here and there. We moved around so much. We lived in Italy, and then we lived in Ethiopia and Uganda. My father worked for the United Nations, so we were always moving. And my mom lived in the United States, but she had remarried and had other children, and had sort of built a life that was very separate from our lives. Um, and I always sort of told myself, and this goes back to sort of not allowing myself to grieve. I had always told myself that I didn't remember having a mother. And yet this absence was very palpable in my life, and sort of shaped me in so many ways. I was very much shaped by that absence. And I actually, the book sort of opens with a memory of my mother when we were 7 and we were living in Rome. And after, a long absence, I hadn't seen her since she was 4. She shows up at our house on the same day that I learned about a catastrophic earthquake that destroyed a city in Armenia. And my mother is Armenian American. But I didn't feel connected to that culture or to that history. I grew up with my Ghanaian father, moving around a lot. And so I remember, because my father never really liked to speak about my mother, which I think was part of the absence. I think he was very hurt by her leaving as well. And so it was sort of this unspoken thing. But if I asked him questions, he would, but I could always tell that it made him profoundly sad. So I would generally avoid asking the questions. But because the news was all about this earthquake in Armenia, I sort of saw an opening, and I asked him, does Mama have family in Armenia? And he said no, that's when he told me, sort of in a way that a child could understand, that sort of no, her family sort of were forced out of their homeland in what was then the Ottoman Empire, and made their way to the United States as refugees. But I remember that moment so vividly. And so for someone who always said, like I don't remember my mother being around, like I clung to those bits and pieces that I could hold on to. And so as I was sort of writing the book, I was asking myself, like, how am I shaped by absence? How was I shaped as much by what was not there in my life as I was by what was? And how do you write about something as unknowable as a mother who was not in your life? Like, how do you miss a person who is not there and who you don't really know? And that was sort of part of the challenge of writing this book, was kind of finding my way into language for that kind of grief, and similarly, like finding my way into language around inherited grief and trauma. And I think that's sort of what you were talking about in terms of my grandmother, my mother's mother, was always worried that her mother was going to leave. And in some ways, my grandmother was somewhat absent from my mother's life. And so, there was this inherited trauma that came from genocide, was sort of passed down through the generations in my family. And how do you give language to that? How do you articulate something that is in so many ways unknowable? We carry it in our bodies, but it's not like you can't point to like, this is where it hurts, So like, how do you find language to write about that sort of trauma? And that was really important to me too, because in understanding why my mother was not in my life, I also had to understand her wound, that she had given me as well. And so that was a big part of the project of the book, as well as sort of reckoning then with the loss of my father, which was a very different loss, because he was the parent who was always present, and then he died. And so that's sort of a different kind of loss. But yeah, I was trying to kind of make meaning and explore and find language for all of those forms of absence.
And the earthquake, I mean, that beginning moment, it really just reverberates throughout the whole book, and it's an anchor for us, right? Because I think in telling this arc of your loss, you jump quite a bit, kind of back and forth in time, and the aftershocks, the fault lines become a real anchor for us in the same way. I thought of Kat with the taxidermied. And this sort of preservation, like that imagery kind of repeating throughout, really anchors us in a story that can, otherwise seem really, an unwieldy emotional kind of force. But can you guys talk about the, I guess in the process of writing, like in style wise, the decision to make use of that kind of repeated motif, that's like, it's very visual, it's very vivid, it's something, well, I guess a taxidermy fish is more tangible than an earthquake, but still, I mean, it's something that we can all really hold on to. It's very evocative. How did those images come about for you?
Yeah, I can start. So once I decided, for a long time, I was writing this for myself. And I was doing a lot of research because I was really trying to write into that generational trauma, as well as sort of the actual events of my life. I was doing a lot of research, and I was exploring Armenian history, the history of the Armenian people, the history of the Armenian genocide, as well as sort of exploring colonialism in Ghana, where my father was from, and sort of trying to understand the forces that shaped the decisions that my family made across generations that then created my life, in terms of my grief, but also in terms of the strength and sort of the more miraculous elements of my life, in terms of me even existing, this combination of Ghanaian and Armenian, like how does that come to be? And what are the forces that sort of brought my parents together ultimately in America. But once I decided, and so when I was sort of writing for myself, I didn't really think a lot about structure or how anything was going to be held together, because I wasn't thinking about any other readers. But because I lived such a hopscotched life, like there wasn't a lot of structure to my life. I was moving around so much. I'm from so many different cultures. I speak a lot of different languages, and so that is the truth of who I am. Like that multiplicity and that non-linearity is such a big part of who I am. So once I decided that I was going to try and turn this to a book, kind of using the raw material I started creating for myself, then I knew both that I needed it to be a genre fluid book and I needed it to be nonlinear, because that was true to my life. But then also I needed to find ways for others to be able to kind of follow this narrative and to find their way into the story. And so what did that look like? What did it look like to kind of move back and forth between my more private griefs and struggles to these larger forces? And particularly since like a big part of the project was wanting to show how history is always present in our day-to-day lives, whether we notice it or not. So then the question becomes sort of, but what is the structure, and what are some anchors that you can give people to hold on to who are not as familiar sort of like with the the different cultures and the stories in my life. And because of that real memory, you know, many of the chapters start with a really vivid memory and then open up into these explorations of other things, whether that's sort of the Armenian genocide or, you know, colonialism in Ghana, or Pan-African philosophy, or the history of jazz. You know, I'm exploring all of these different elements, but it starts with a vivid memory, and then I sort of open up into these broader explorations, and I'm trying to make those connections in that way. And one of the first ones that came to me was the earthquake, the memory of that earthquake, because that was a really vivid memory in my life, because it was the same day that my mother showed up after such a long absence. And so then I realized that earthquakes have always been sort of a guiding metaphor for my life in some ways because of that memory. And I really liked the fact that the story of an earthquake is not linear and is not easily understood except in retrospect, you know? And so that's how I felt about my life story. Like, we don't know, we think that it's the earthquake, but actually it was a foreshock, and you have to reshuffle the story. And so then once I sort of caught on to that, I was like, oh, I can actually use this to sort of create a structure that people can hold on to, but it doesn't feel imposed. It feels more organic and truthful because it's so connected to this memory that was really important in my life.
Yeah. For seeing ghosts, so, you know, Adam before was saying that it took him, or he'd been in a way writing this for 8 years, but maybe inactively, and then it all kind of came out in 3 weeks. I also feel similarly about Seeing Ghosts, where it was a project that I had been writing versions of for so long. And a lot of it was fictionalized in this attempt that I wrote in college, where as a part of this process of drafting Seeing Ghosts, I went back and looked at old blog posts or journal entries. And in one that I wrote in college, I wrote something to the effect of magic realism, yes or no? And was trying to figure out a way to work that into the story, because I loved reading Chinese American folklore, Asian American folklore, where spirits are such a big part of the way we tell stories. And then, you know, that kind of just sat in my head for a decade or so. And I forgot about it completely as I was sitting down and trying to write Seeing Ghosts. And it made so much sense, because the way that I was beginning this book is by trying to tell the story of the first time my mother saw a dead body. And then by trying to correct that memory, and also by trying to tell a ghost story, which is this retelling of a joke my mom made when I was 9 years old, which was even before she knew that she was terminally ill, she, knowing that I was afraid of dead things and afraid of taxidermied animals, like what you see at a hunting store or something like that, or in a museum, my mother told my 9-year-old self that when she eventually passed, she wanted to be stuffed and put in my future apartment, so that she could always watch over me. And that's just a profoundly upsetting, messed up thing to joke to your baby kid. And I remember as a kid being very horrified, but there was something so visceral about that imagery, where as a child, it immediately made me think of this zombie-like creature. And my mother was playful and always trying to instill fear, where she would create these monsters for my sisters and I to try and get us to behave. And so that, plus also this concept in a lot of East Asian cultures, but Chinese culture specifically, that my family would adhere to, is that the dead are meant to be appeased, otherwise their spirits will be restless. And I loved that because, well, I didn't love that as a teenager. I found that actually profoundly disturbing. But as an adult, I loved that as a storytelling device, because I thought it merged so well with this joke that my mom made. And I knew that if I could figure out the tone and the way to combine this joke with this beautiful tradition and this idea of spirits, then maybe it could become a way to incorporate that question that I was talking about earlier of what do we owe? So how do I appease my mother, or how do I appease her spirit? And when I was writing it, I was really trying, I mean, the tone was so hard, because how do you bring your mother back to life, and how do you write about her in such a bodily form that is both acerbic, that is both sort of goofy, but also respectful. And at times I try and make her very menacing. At times I try and make it very deadpan and channeling this kind of like Weekend at Bernie's vibe. But I also just wanted her presence to be a little bit, you know, uncertain, where she's just always lingering, because that's so much like grief. It's this memory that comes up and you always are engaging with it, even if you don't want it, even if you're you know, you don't want to look at it because then you have to acknowledge it, but really it's sitting behind your shoulder, messing with you. And so I loved this imagery of just, you know, she might not be in my apartment physically, but there she is in spirit, and you never know when she's there, and it's startling and it's profound and funny.
I love the idea of a magical realist memoir. Like, I think it's like a really cool kind of genre bending idea. But of course that is, you know, I think it just exposes, you know, we often think of nonfiction as pure fact, but like obviously, particularly when it comes to personal narratives like these, you know, there are always like fault lines, and there are always gaps. And it reminds me of what Adam was saying about, you know, just the decision which you struggled with of like what genre to put this story into, and kind of landing in verse, right, in poetry, but still with some, you know, fact, but with some whatever liberties that medium allows. And I'd love to hear from you just what you think that opened up for you. And I have to say that I listened to the audiobook version of the story, and it's really amazing. I mean, there's music. I mean, it feels like a fully produced kind of multi-sensory experience. So when you said that you thought about writing it into a screenplay, I really I could see that. Like I could hear and feel that that there are just aspects, especially of the audiobook, that I think are conveyed without words. So yeah, if you can just talk about the way you decided to tell this story and how it just flowed out.
Yeah, I'm glad you listened to the audiobook. You know, because before the pandemic hit, I was gearing up to tour this book, and my conception of it was definitely for it to be kind of a multimedia experience. I had the notion that at least sometimes I wanted to be in front of an audience reading the entire book, which only takes, you know, 65 minutes. Yeah. And I wanted to sprinkle just enough audio and sort of visual cues that it could feel like a complete experience, not just some dude standing behind a podium turning pages. And I'd gone as far as to kind of approach collaborators and think about what that might feel like, both for me and for an audience. And again, I mean, the nature of this book for me is such a fraught one that even that idea ended up sort of bifurcating into pluses and minuses and various kinds of paradox, because it was like, when I actually sat down to record the audiobook, I was breaking down. You can probably hear it. I'm like close to tears frequently in the course of recording that book. So part of me was like, wow, I really dodged a bullet. That would have been unbearable for audiences to listen to. I don't want to be that guy up there almost crying and everybody's like, come on, you can do it, you can do it. And at the same time, I don't want to become so desensitized to the words in this book that I can recite it with no problem. So, you know, this is my process, is like fretting over an idea that's not even going to happen and making it a problem. I mean, in terms of the form, and I was thinking as Nadia and Kat were talking as well about, you know, motif and theme and all of that. And, you know, what comes to mind, and I think it speaks both to the form and the process, and also how I tried to lay some things through that might make it sort of more legible. The thing that comes up a lot for me is the idea of the mask. This is something that recurs in the book in a couple of forms. There is the mask that my brother wore to hide his depression, and that in a way ultimately kills him, right? He makes a decision that it is more terrifying to be seen than to kill himself. That to tell his story is to do the very thing that he refused to do. And then there's also the mask that I wore throughout this time, because through sheer coincidence, my brother takes his own life exactly as my book, Go the Fuck to Sleep, is coming out and becoming this unexpected like phenomenon. And so I'm suddenly faced with having to be, or really having to make the choice to be incredibly public and see myself sort of split in two, see myself put on a mask just as he had done, which was very complicated and uncomfortable and distasteful, and also felt incredibly necessary to me. I'm engaging in this like hyper public act of embodying a certain kind of like surprise and success. And I'm like the luckiest asshole in the world. My obscene fake children's book is taking the world by storm. And at the time, I'm terrified that somebody's gonna like blindside me with a question about my brother. This is not how the Today Show operates. You know what I mean? Like, nobody stands to profit by blindsiding me in that way. But it seemed imminently possible to me the entire time that I was out there giving a million interviews, you know, and I'm actively writing him out of my life as I'm being public and not talking about what's actually going on in my life. In a way, it feels like the thing I have to do for my family, for myself, to prove that life goes on. There's also my own ambition, which feels nasty and gross to me. But like at no point did I really seriously consider not promoting that book. But also, although on one hand, it's like proof that life goes on another hand, there's the part of me that's thinking, am I proving my brother right? He essentially contested that he would not be missed, that he was better off and we were better off without him. Am I demonstrating that by going out here and acting as if everything is okay and life does go on and there are books to promote and interviews to give and like jokes to make? So all of this was sort of swirling around me, and I think it led me to the motif of the mask. Long before I was prepared to write the book, I remember discussing the idea of the mask with my editor, Chris Jackson, who is a good friend I had done a couple novels with before. And he and I were kicking around the idea of this book long before I was ready to write it, because he watched me go through it in real time. And, you know, in early days, there was the idea that I would use my own personal notion of the mask to connect to sort of larger societal issues around race and identity, which are things I tend to write about as well. But ultimately, like, the form that I chose was really the one that allowed me to move with the most alacrity, the most speed, and to let connections be made through proximity, and allowed me to, I think a lot about a conversation I once had when I was a roadie with Elvin Jones. I was riding back from a gig with a piano player named Eric Lewis, who was a brilliant young guy, but extremely eccentric. Like, the rest of the band didn't know what to make of him, because like he grew up super religious. His path kind of diverged from everybody else's around the age of 9. So the only things he could make conversation about with the rest of the cats in the band were like childhood shit. Everybody would be talking about whatever, and he'd be like, y'all remember Ghost Rider? And everybody would be like, what are you talking about? But I was asking him about his conception of a solo, how he thought about a solo, how he structured a solo, how he approached it. And what he said was basically that nobody should be able to understand a solo in real time. You can't track a solo or appreciate a solo until the last note is played, until the landing is stuck and it's over, and you go back and look back at it. And I was like, my man, that is not how people listen to music. That does not make any sense. You're like eradicating the temporal experience. That's the only thing jazz actually is. But in the writing of this book, I found myself doing exactly that a lot. I would get it in my head that a certain story of mine, a certain part of my existence, was somehow a part of this book, even if it sort of deviated from the main spine of the book, the story of David's life and death. And I wouldn't exactly know why, but I trusted my instincts with this book more than I ever have in any other project. I didn't second guess. I just went blindly ahead. Part of that is the speed with which you can write poetry. You know, it's only going to cost you a day if you fuck up. But a lot of times I would not know where I was going until I got to the landing, and until that landing connected this side trip to the main spine of the book, to the story of my brother. That was the case with my story of the last time Elvin Jones ever played the drums, a story about my grandfather that I tell, a lot of stuff that came up for me about ritual and ancestry and my own sort of fraught relationship to Judaism. So in as much as I had a process, I guess those are some thoughts about it.
Yeah, so thank you. And everyone, please remember you can order books in the link below. And please do consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is this year celebrating its 16th year of presenting all free literary programming. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you. It was great.